Welcome. If you don't know what you've signed up for, I know we have some new faces this time again, which I'm really excited about. You are attending the EPA Assessment Grant Stakeholder Meeting for the Department of Environmental Quality. As you all know, we have an EPA assessment grant. These meetings are part of our community involvement plan. That is a requirement of EPA. But we are happy to provide information. And so my goal for all of these meetings is I have to provide the update of what we're doing on our sites, but I also want to provide additional resources for all of our municipalities we're working with. Um, so our agenda for today, we're going to go over a little bit more of our outreach and recruiting efforts. We are some information about our property progress, what we've been working on the last quarter. Our some additional EPA grant funding. If you're familiar with the EPA grant funding, you know that you're in a cycle of grant writing right now. So we'll go over a little bit of that information. And the UNC development, our technical topic for today is vapor intrusion, sorry. And UNC's Development Finance Initiative, Eric Thomas is here to tell you a little bit about their resources towards the end of the meeting. So I'll make sure we have plenty of time for him and plenty of time for questions for them as well. So the photo here is my colleague and I, and we were in Knoxville last week for the new grantee meeting workshop put on by EPA. We were excited to kind of have a private tour from the DEQ Brownfields coordinator, who's Paula Middlebrooks, and just a delight if you've ever heard her speak at any conference. She's great. The site you see behind her is the site started in 2009 and 2010 with an EPA assessment grant. It is an old hospital building. And so from what we understand, the kind of this circular part is part of the former hospital. They actually kind of incorporated some of the former hospital structures and then added some of the multifamily residential on that top of that. So it was really cool to see the end product of that. And they have a great river trail right along the water. So we were able to take a good walk and see the city of Knoxville. So that was pretty great. On our outreach and recruiting efforts, we have been reaching out to local councils of government across the state to offer a Brownfields 101 training. We conducted two so far, one virtual and one in person. Our next one is with the Eastern Carolina Council, happening in November. So we're very excited about that opportunity. It'll be our first one in the far east side of the state. So we also, the virtual one we were able to record. So I now joke that I'm YouTube famous. So our Brownfields 101 training, that was done for the Lumber River Council of Governments. And that training is available on our DEQ YouTube page. Also something I didn't know existed, but it does. So if you aren't able to make one of the trainings or just really curious about Brownfields, that is a great resource as well. Lastly, one of the things we are working on, the state of North Carolina does internships every summer. There's a whole office devoted to internships across the state. What we have written up and have recently gotten approved, we've requested that we receive applications for interns to conduct community-wide community planning and potentially some brownfields inventories in our target areas. So we don't know, obviously, which interns or who will actually apply for this internship. So it really depends on that person's skill set whenever we're able to get an intern in place. These internships are posted in December. What I'll try to remember is to send you all the link, and hopefully if you have colleges or universities in your communities, you can share those internships, because some of them are really, really cool. I mean, ours is going to be really cool, clearly, but there are other internships that are really fun as well. They are paid internships. And ours, I've listed it as an optional, like a hybrid position, and it could be either based near me in Mooresville or Raleigh. And so my hope would be to get somebody that is a GIS major, planning major, something along those lines to help with our community planning efforts. These internships, they're listed in November. They have to apply in January or February, and we do interviews in early March. So it feels like they're a little earlier than most other college internships. So and they're only here for 10 weeks, I think. So what I would love to do is have some projects lined up If you have an idea for your community, if you need a brownfields inventory, if you have a site that you would like to see some designs done on, again, I can't make any guarantees because I don't know who will have apply, but I would love to have some projects lined up. If we're not able to fulfill those project needs with an intern, then maybe we can help you coordinate with a tab provider and something like that. We can get some of that work done regardless of how it happens. But so if you have any ideas, please reach out. I'd love to have some things lined up for our summer intern this year.
Let me just jump in here too, if I can,
Sure, please.
Jocelyn, and say the last 2 years of summer interns we've had some really excellent people who've done amazing work. So this really is an opportunity we feel to get some cool things done along these lines. And in fact, we have hired two of those interns that we've had in the summer because they were so sharp. So we feel like this is an excellent opportunity. That's all, Johnson.
And for those of you who aren't familiar, this is Bruce Nicholson. He's the Brownfields redevelopment section manager. All right, so moving on to our sites. Thanks, Bruce. We've got a site in Dunn that is pending an application. We know that that one's going to be coming in shortly. We've also added the CF Nitrogen property in Hertford County. We've been working on developing a scope of work for that assessment. So we have a pretty good range of projects across the state, and I'm pleased with the sites that we have rolling in. We've got a couple of phase 2 proposals out, or phase 1 proposals out. So those are all great things. Word seems to be getting out that we have this money available, but please share with your counterparts in your municipality meetings. If there's ever a meeting you want me to attend, we're trying to go to the League of Municipalities things and different organizations to get the word out. So I'm happy to attend those if you let me know. Sorry, went a little too fast. So Smoot Tannery, you've all heard about this one of our priority sites from our application. We were able to finish up the phase 2 work. We have an asbestos and lead-based paint report that is complete. Our priority on this assessment is while asbestos and lead sampling is an eligible cost for EPA assessment grants, it's not the primary way we want to spend a majority of our funds. But in this instance, a lot of the tannery buildings or tannery operations are under buildings that are dilapidated and falling in on themselves. So we wouldn't be in kind of planning for the cleanup process and the redevelopment phase of things. It was really necessary to get an asbestos and lead report completed so that they can get a cost estimate for demolition, so that we can access if there's any significant areas of risk. So that was a pretty important part of Smoot Tannery's work. We have also coordinated with our Region 4 technical assistance for brownfields provider on this site. The site is not yet owned by North Wilkesboro, and they don't have a specific plan for the property yet, but the hope is to get them a market study to be able to understand what the highest and best use is, and some potential plans that will be based on our assessment as well. If you recall previous meetings, we've talked with our tab providers. Tab provider, this work is done at no cost to the municipalities. This smokestack is really an amazing feature. I was able to drive around North Wilkesboro this quarter, and from their downtown, this smokestack is visible from almost every point within their downtown. So it is something that they've expressed an interest in keeping. So we're evaluating how we can get a structural stability survey, even with all the kudzu growing on it. So we want to make sure we can safely keep the smokestack and what it might need to be able to continue to stand. Let's see. Pembroke Oil. Pembroke Oil was also one of our priority sites. It was one of the first ones we did the assessments on. We have a phase 2 ESA report drafted. That means we've conducted the soil and soil gas sampling and groundwater sampling at this facility. We did find significant petroleum impacts in soil, groundwater, and soil gas at this property. Pembroke Oil was a bulk oil distributor. We also have some herbicides in soils, and we were recently able to talk with the community about what this all this data means, right? The implications are that there will likely need to be some land use restrictions restricting drinking of groundwater. You're going to want to make sure the soil's managed during construction, and there's probably going to need to be a cover at the end of construction to make sure nobody is digging in the soil in the future. So the next steps for this one is for the community to discuss the community's acquisition of the property. They do have some really great plans for a community center and additional municipal office space, which is sorely needed in the community. And we're very excited to help with that next phase. Right now, we're also working with some of our partners to try to identify funding for development of building plans. One of the needs for this property will be a vapor mitigation system. We're going to talk a little bit more about vapor mitigation later, but we will likely, any new building on this property will likely need vapor mitigation. In order to develop a plan for vapor mitigation, we need to know what the building is going to look like and what the construction details are. So unfortunately, no one can do a vapor mitigation plan until we have that document. So we're trying to coordinate some funding to get that building design completed. Beaufort Marine Park was also one of our priority sites from our application. If you recall from last meeting, we split this into two properties, two Brownfields agreements sites within the state. The town of Belhaven owns one portion and Beaufort County owns the other. And so we actually we've split it into two sites. The assessment work on the Beaufort Marine Park, the town of Belhaven's parcel, is the first phase of that is complete. They have a boat ramp. They have a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service grant to do a boat ramp, and they'll be starting construction in January. So we needed to make sure we had all the assessment they needed in order to disturb soil before that construction. So we were able to hold off on the rest of the property. And so that next phase of the phase two, right? We split our phase two into kind of two different rounds. That is pending in the next quarter. Tillman Track is in a nearby, right next across a creek from Beaufort Marine, and it is that site specific QAP or work plan is being prepared, and we'll likely be conducting that assessment in the next quarter as well. Leland Auto Salvage was one of our sites that we added. It was actually in the state Brownfields program before. Leland had applied as the prospective developer on their own, and when we were able to talk with them about the assessment and identify that they were in our target area, and we were really glad to be able to incorporate them into our assessment work. The field work for the phase two assessment is complete. We ended up doing a methane assessment here as well because of past reports of buried debris. So we really want to make sure that we're not going to, if there is methane, we may need to consider different construction mechanisms for a parking lot or things like that to make sure it has an opportunity to vent. And we are still waiting on the draft report. I know our consultant is working on that one right now. So next steps will be, once we are able to take a look at the assessment, to review those results with the community and talk about what the implications and their land use restrictions might look like on this property. So I mentioned we went to the EPA new grantee workshop last week. It was really great to meet with all the new grantees, and it's just always a wonderful experience working with EPA in these meetings. One of the things they shared, these are the fiscal year 2024 grant solicitations are currently posted. They are due, all the applications are due November 13th. So if you have an application pending, you need a letter from the state, please get that to us, that request to us soon so that we can prepare that support letter for you. But what I really wanted to call out about this data are these cleanup numbers. So this year, this is what EPA is projecting that they will award in this fiscal year 2024. So last year in 2023, cleanup grants were awarded at approximately a rate of between 90 and 95% success rate, whereas your community-wide assessment grants were at a kind of typical 30 to 35% success rate. Our understanding is that for assessment grants, they are going to award more. They focused on new grantees last year, folks who had never had an award. Our understanding is that they are going to award more funds to existing grantees or essentially folks who have had past assessment grants. But I think where we can help, so remember, this represents the year 3 of our bill funding that EPA was awarded under the bill. So we will have 2 more years that will likely look fairly similar. So the key to these is that these cleanup grants, you have a $2 million and a $5 million cap, right? If you apply for the 500,000, you're applying against others that applied for 500,000. Same for 2 million and 5 million. You're being compared against those each of those categories. But the fact that there's no cost share and they're being awarded at a fairly high rate last year, there's pretty good odds for cleanup grants in the next coming years. Now, you may not be ready for a cleanup grant right now. And honestly, if you haven't written your application and done your public notice by now, you're probably not ready for this fiscal year's round of assessment, a round of funds. But what I would suggest is let's start talking about how we can get you ready for a cleanup grant for fiscal year 2025. The applications typically go in November every year, October, November-ish. So we have a solid year to get an assessment done, make sure you have a cleanup plan in place, and make sure that the grantee owns the property. So some of the requirements are that the eligible entity has to own the property. This means you have to have your phase 1 done within 6 months of acquiring that property. You have to be a municipality, and you have to have a cleanup plan in place and understand that you're in a voluntary cleanup program with the state. So I think right now is a great time if you have a property that you really are looking at, well, we really want to do something with this in the next handful of years. Now's the time. Let's try to get the assessments done and the cleanup planning, those work plans for what we need to do in place so that you're situated to better apply for a cleanup grant in fiscal year 2025. So please call me with questions about cleanup grants, or if you have a project in mind that we're not already working on, let's see how we can get you ready. All right, so our technical topic for today is going to be vapor intrusion. Vapor intrusion is something that we are going to assess in all of your sites. I mean, at this point, it's a baseline requirement for the state Brownfields program. Vapor intrusion, and this is a very simplified model of vapor intrusion from EPA. It essentially is the volatilization of chemicals off of a plume or a source or some sort of release of chemicals through the air spaces in soil, right? So soil is made up of soil particles, but there's also pore space and air in there too. So those chemicals can volatilize. So sometimes I like to tell people, like, as you're standing by your car and you're pumping gasoline, right? And you smell the fumes of benzene, the petroleum coming off your car, right? That's volatilization. That's what you're not, I mean, you don't have the liquid coming out the thing, it's going into your car, right? But you can still smell it. That's what volatilization is. So it comes off of contaminated soil and groundwater and can accumulate in basements or under building slabs fairly easily. Also consider radon. You all may be familiar with radon, a radon mitigation system, things like that. The concept is similar, right? So it's a compound that comes out of the ground and accumulates in spaces where people are living, and we don't really want to be breathing those chemicals. We have to test for this because it's so unpredictable. Just because it's in groundwater does not necessarily mean you're going to have a vapor intrusion risk. It depends on what your building looks like. It depends on geology of the area. There's a lot of things that it depends on. So we always require a baseline sampling event. It also migrates in kind of unique ways, right? So just like water kind of finds the easiest flow path, right? Air does the same thing. So if you have a utility line that's a nice, neat gravel, a nice gravel base, you may very well, and everything else is tight clays around it, you may very well have this preferential pathway where vapor can be migrating along those lines. There's a couple different methods of sampling for this. Probably the best, most representative sample is called sub-slab sampling. That's where we drill a small hole in the concrete slab and put a sampler point just into the gravel base below the slab and collect a sample of the air right there. That's showing what's actually collected underneath your slab. So you could do that in a basement, like right under here. You could do this in this house here, that where it's right under the slab. From there, if you have high levels, you would maybe want to consider some indoor air sampling in your basement or on your first floor, things like that. So it is something that has become a more serious concern, and it's a pathway that wasn't really recognized for until fairly recently. One of the other things that we're addressing with vapor intrusion is a compound called trichloroethylene, or TCE. It is a chlorinated solvent. It was used a lot in cleaning parts, like parts washers and cleaning equipment. TCE has been found to cause fetal heart malformations very early on in a woman's pregnancy. And so there are very short-term exposure risks of having TCE. So we do have different sampling, we do have different management requirements when we have a site that has TCE on it. Because of the vapor risk, and we've seen this on a lot of sites, oh my gosh, the majority of our brownfield sites now have vapor mitigation systems. So it's really something that I want you all to kind of understand, as that may very well be part of your project, and start planning for that and planning for those costs. These are two examples of mitigation systems. This one is called Cupolex. It is essentially creates a space under the slab that then can be ventilated. You can pull the air out, or it can naturally ventilate from under the building. It gives air a way to escape where it's not coming up into the building. Another option is a liner, just a typical, you're talking a plastic barrier, but this is much more than your typical 10 mil moisture barrier that's probably on your house now. So these are designed for chemicals, and they won't break down in the presence of chemicals. And they're often partnered with venting, so that people can, so that you can it gives the air a pathway out other than through the building. Most likely, you are going to have to do, once your building is constructed, you're likely going to have to do some sort of pre-occupancy sampling. And like I said, that sub-slab sample is the most representative of what's accumulated under your building. So when you put a new building on a property, you change the conditions of the property. There may be new gravel layers. There may be, if you have a vacant property, the air can constantly kind of flow through the soil. Once you put a building or parking lot on it, it changes that dynamic and the airflow on the site. So that's why we have moved towards these pre-occupancy sampling requirements. Now, the thing is, part of why we've had to do these is because we've noticed problems, right? We had a site where they had a vapor mitigation system designed. It had chlorinated solvents in groundwater, and they installed the vapor mitigation system, and we went to do the pre-occupancy. In this case, it was indoor air testing. So they collected the indoor air samples, and thankfully this was before anyone lived there, because this was a residential space. And we're seeing chlorinated solvents in the indoor air. So we're not comfortable with people occupying the space yet. Why are we seeing these chlorinated solvents? This mitigation system is designed to break that pathway. It turns out that after lots of research by the consultants, it turns out that the plumber, when he installed the bathtubs, had punctured the vapor barrier and not sealed around the pipe that went down to the sewer line. So he created a pathway where there was just enough space. Air will find a way, right? So there was just enough space between the pipe and the vapor barrier where it was punctured to create a risk to those residences. Thankfully, once it's sealed and once it's fixed, then we were back in action, right? We were able to do additional indoor air testing, prove that it had been fixed and corrected. And that's why you see these pre-occupancy sampling requirements now. So that it's really hard to check every little section of this vapor mitigation system. But when you're collecting indoor air samples, if you have your problem or not. So we also are requiring more ongoing sampling in the future. So that is typically looks like maybe a semi-annual sampling event, at least for 2 years. So you would have your pre-occupancy sampling, and then 6 months later a sampling event, and then you would do that maybe 3 more times. And if it's stable and if there's no issues, then we'll consider reducing or removing those sampling requirements. But that is something that allows us to make sure that the building, we're not seeing, nobody's cutting through those vapor barriers. We're seeing that the concentrations are consistent under the slab, nothing's increasing over time, things like that. So that is something to plan for as well, or those ongoing sampling requirements. We recently were able to, in order to provide some consistency, and so for the consultants that are working in our program on the private side, we wanted to make sure that they had an ability to cost estimate and predict what would be likely based on the conditions of a site. So we were able to put together a guidance document. The guidance document was released in March 2023 as a draft. We had a stakeholder meeting with many of the consultants that work in our program, and we kind of explained, here's what we're seeing, here's why we feel that this needs to be done. So if you really want a deep dive into vapor intrusion and why we've done all these things, the meeting link is available here for you all to review. It is a much more technical discussion than what I've gone through today. So vapor intrusion is just something to be aware of, and to know that we're going to test for it. So, yeah.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
No, you're fine. Did you have a question? I'm sorry, didn't quite hear you.
Oh, I was just wondering if you put the link in the chat. It's hard to click on
Yep.
it.
Oh, yeah. I will. Yep. Yes, I can do that. And I will also, the slides are also on our Laserfiche portal too. But that will be, so you can click it from the PowerPoint, but yeah, you're just viewing my screen, so you wouldn't be able to click on it right now. So, yeah. So that is vapor intrusion. I did want to mention we were hopeful to have the city of Salisbury to talk about one of her projects, Kessler Mill. Unfortunately, Hannah was unable to join us, mostly because I gave her very little notice and did not do a good job planning this. So my apologies, but Hannah was gracious enough for me to share her contact information, which will also be on the slides. She's happy to talk about her project in Salisbury, where she is working with DFI. So that is my segue into Eric Thomas's discussion.
Yeah, and I will talk about Salisbury a little bit, but
great.
Probably not to the historic level that Hannah could talk about, but I'll give a slide kind of detailing what DFI has been working on in Salisbury too. So
that's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
So Eric, I can give you
I'll
intro,
share my,
or I'll just let you, I'll stop sharing and I'll let Eric take over.
Can you all see, let's see here. Can you all see the slide DFI overview?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me here today. Excited to give you all maybe a little bit of overview of Development Finance Initiative, who we are, what we do. It's wonderful seeing this group of people talk about, real estate and getting projects repurposed, revitalized, adding some value to communities, and all the complexities that go along with seeing properties revitalized and redeveloped. For those that don't know, Development Finance Initiative, we are a small group, essentially a real estate consulting firm that's based out of UNC Chapel Hill School of Government. We work with local governments, solely with local governments across North Carolina on typically real estate development projects. Oftentimes public-private partnerships. We've been doing a lot of work in affordable housing, but downtown revitalization, brownfields. We end up oftentimes working on a lot of brownfield sites, just based on sort of what communities' interests are in seeing building and seeing sites redeveloped. For those that don't know much about the School of Government, the School of Government is the largest university-based local government training, advisory, and research organization in the United States. They are an amazing team at the School of Government of attorneys and experts that specialize in all things local governments, public administration. So if you all ever have a question about anything related to local governments, I advise you give the School of Government a call. I'm sure there is someone there that can, in a very responsive manner, answer the question that you may have, or at least guide you in the right direction to answering the question that you may have. At DFI, we've been around for a little over a decade, about 12 years, essentially to answer the questions for local governments of can we, one, participate in real estate deals with private developers, and in what sort of statutory authority do we have to legally participate, whether that's selling property, whether that's providing key infrastructure to support redevelopment. And B, why really DFI was formed was to answer the next question of, does this make financial sense for us, the local government, to participate in this real estate, this public-private partnership deal with these private developers? Oftentimes, private developers get this sort of view that they're trying to maximize their profits solely, and DFI can come in to answer the questions of, A, is their deal, does this make financial sense what they're asking for in terms of public participation? Or B, hey, here's ways that we think there might be ways to minimize the public investment in a project. Just kind of talking a little bit about the private pre-development process, and why there's such a, oftentimes this challenge maybe to seeing real estate development occur in some of these submarkets across North Carolina. It's a long and lengthy and expensive process that private developers go through in order to get projects redeveloped. And so oftentimes, the most expensive part of the pre-development process comes when there's a project has the most level of uncertainty. So there's an idea, gaining site control, performing that due diligence feasibility analysis. And let me turn on my laser pointer so you all can see here. But all of these pieces of this pre-development process cost the private developer a lot of time and a lot of money without having any certainty that a project is going to occur. And then you can see all the way going through a project till entitlement, where the project is approved. Do you really feel like you have a project that is fully vetted, ready to go? And then you have the whole construction process, and then lease up and all that. That adds to sort of the challenges and complexities of real estate development. What we communicate with local governments all the time across North Carolina is the local government, whether you want to or not, you can play a critical role in seeing, essentially maybe easing or unlocking, or maybe it's even ensuring that your public interests are met in the private real estate development process. And so oftentimes what we advise on is, at the idea portion, rather than a private developer coming to the table and saying, here's what we believe makes most sense for this site, is local government, you all may have an idea of what you'd like to see happen. Those are your public interests. And so kind of at the beginning of this process, that idea, formation of an idea, that's where the local government can play a role. Site control. Sometimes the most suitable sites for development are oftentimes maybe they have a challenge to being unlocked. Maybe they're privately held, or maybe you have a public parcel that's right next to a private one that, when you combine both of them, makes for an impactful project in your community. So local governments, you can play this role in gaining site control, gaining long-term options, et cetera, to make sure that you have a project that can be attractive to being redeveloped. And this is where I showed on that previous slide, where there's a lot of money spent from the private developer in sort of the pre-development process. This is oftentimes where you have the sort of local government that can step in, do the financial modeling, financial assessment, perform market research. I know Jocelyn mentioned sort of market studies in order to understand really what the potential is for redevelopment. But doing this feasibility analysis at the forefront, market research, financial modeling, understanding your public interest about a project, evaluating the site's potential for a market-driven project, all to set up what might be a public-private partnership on the site. There might be public investment that can be a tool, or leverage that public investment to attract a private development partner. So all of this can be done from the public's perspective to essentially set up a project for a private developer to ultimately come in and do the project, save them money, save them risk, but also essentially set up a project, make it easier so that your public interest can be met also. And then ultimately, going through in terms of that entitlement process and acquisition. And so going to this feasibility analysis, this portion, this is really where DFI, what we get engaged with most of the time with local governments is to perform this feasibility study. We'll come in and help them understand and identify sites that can be attractive for development, whether it's for affordable housing or whether we just kind of understand the market opportunity and identify sites that can be suitable. But really, this feasibility analysis is where we do a lot of our work. This is a box, an unfolding box that we essentially model our pre-development feasibility analysis after. This is the exact process that a private developer typically takes when evaluating the potential redevelopment opportunity or the potential development opportunity. One thing that we feel like at DFI that we differentiate ourselves from a private development perspective when evaluating projects is we do heavy community involvement to understand what those public interests might be, so that then we can start to layer in, can the site that we're working on or identify sites meet those public interests? Does the market, in terms of the demand of certain product types, do the rents justify what it costs to acquire land? All those things that we do in market research, does that meet public interests, or are the public interests, do we need to reprioritize those? And then what we oftentimes where sort of all of this work comes together is in financial modeling. I'm glad Jocelyn brought up that idea of the vapor mitigation strategies, what those additional costs might be. DFI, what we'll have to do in our financial model is take that into consideration in terms of what those additional costs might be in certain projects to understand how does that impact the returns from a private development perspective. If it makes the project more challenging, ultimately those additional costs will most likely result in a more challenging, financially feasible project. How do we layer in the potential public involvement in legal ways, in statutory authority to participate in deals in legal ways, to ultimately come up with a set of final recommendations or a strategy for redevelopment for a site? So this is not a follow a line to do public interest, site analysis, market research, financial modeling to get to a final project. It's definitely very iterative, and what we may find from our financial modeling may impact how we think about our site analysis, which may think about how we alter or prioritize the different public interests associated with a project. Today I'm going to walk through a few of the projects. So these are projects that the DFI's worked on, these dots across North Carolina. We have done work in South Carolina and Virginia also, but the bulk of our work is in North Carolina. This map is dated. It doesn't have all of the dots, but you can see we work from the mountains out to the Outer Banks. And we've done several projects that have involved in Brownfields agreements, and I'm going to highlight a few of these today, and one of those being Kessler Mill. And I'll touch on just sort of a quick overview of the Kessler Mill project. This is a really cool project that we got to work on in Gastonia with the city of Gastonia. They had a really awesome concept plan to develop a entertainment and sports district on the west side of Gastonia. As part of this entertainment district, this is this image here on the top right. They wanted to build a new minor league baseball stadium and then identify several parcels around the baseball stadium that could be suitable for private development to, one, increase the tax base in this area and potentially offset, in sort of one way thinking about it, offset the costs of this public infrastructure investments and amenity investments. One of those project sites is the Trenton Mill, which is this image on the bottom right. We worked with the city of Gastonia, wanted to identify what those public interests are. They wanted to preserve this beautiful old mill in this entertainment and sports district. They wanted to increase the tax base in this area. They wanted to see housing in this area of the city that hadn't had a lot of residential activity for a long period of time. So we worked with the city to, one, identify those public interests and then evaluate the redevelopment potential for this mill. The mill was redeveloped into 85 market rate residential units. It was about a $24 million investment. The city ultimately, as part of this redevelopment strategy and the public-private partnership, took on landmark status as part of the redevelopment strategy. Historic tax credits were utilized. The city initiated a Brownfields agreement on this site, and then they also invested in other key infrastructure, parking to support the stadium. They built the stadium itself. And so they invested heavily in other infrastructure. They were planning on doing that regardless in this area, but they invested in this infrastructure to see not only this site, the Trenton Mill, redeveloped, but also there's a former Coca-Cola bottling site here that's been redeveloped in this time. And then setting the stage for future infill new construction project sites, parcel C here in purple, and then another retail parcel here along the baseball stadium. I don't have an image of the baseball stadium. I was talking more about the sort of private development here of Trent Mill, but the stadium has been built. Both of these historic adaptive reuse, utilizing historic tax credit sites, have been redeveloped. And then the city did initiate a Brownfields agreement on this site and pass it off to the developer, Lansing Melbourne Group, as part of the redevelopment strategy to hit that financial returns that the developer needed to have as part of the redevelopment of this project. If any of you have questions along this way, I only have a few case studies, but if you chime in asking me if you ask me specifics about what kind of contamination, I won't have those answers. But if about like the financial feasibility or these tools like landmark status, historic tax credits, I'm happy to dive into what those mean and how those were incorporated into the feasibility analysis.
Eric, if you don't mind, I'll just throw in that because the state Brownfields agreement provides for tax abatement on the back end of a completed agreement. That's where they were able to make, it sounds like that helped them make their numbers work out. And if y'all have, but I'm happy to go into more detail on the tax credits. Maybe in another call, we can have a specific discussion of tax credits, but
yeah, and then we do heavily modeling of that, and that became part of the, obviously with the city initiated, that's a lot of lift up front that the city took on in terms of entering into that Brownfields agreement, in terms of the assessments, the research, the determining of what uses could be potentially acceptable on this site. But those tax credits that ultimately, as part of this financial modeling of this project, became a critical tool that the developer needed to make this project work in an area that didn't have a lot of market rate residential. And so that process of the city initiating that, leading that was very beneficial to ultimately landing a private developer to realize this project that they wanted to see happen in this area. Another project another question?
Sorry. Yeah, this is Jordan. If I can add just a little more color to that to tie in Jocelyn's technical talk and what we call this Trenton Cotton Mill in Gastonia, this really highlights why we need a thorough baseline vapor assessment. This is another site where we had kind of a surprise. We did some vapor sampling. Just as a quick check, nothing's going to be there. We just wanted to make sure. And we ended up having that TCE that Jocelyn talked about in the basement area and had to end up doing a lot of mitigation in the building itself. So this just really highlights why we need that vapor sampling, why your developers are going to need that to utilize something like DFI to do their feasibility study for how much is this going to cost.
Perfect. Let me see if I can shift to the next slide here. This was one of DFI's first projects that we got involved in. It was with the city of Wilmington. It was the Water Street parking deck in the downtown core of Wilmington. Really exciting site. It was a parking deck that was built in the 60s. I think it was a very key focal area of the community. I think fireworks were set off from the Water Street parking deck, 4th of July, but it was old, it was dilapidated. This was ultimately DFI working with the city of Wilson to, again, do that pre-development analysis, market research, site analysis, financial modeling, community's interests. The community's interests were the community was very engaged in this process from the beginning, as this is a key site in downtown Wilmington, in the historic district. And so there was a lot of community rallying around how to orient and develop a site in downtown that didn't impact the rest of the historic district and other views to the Cape Fear River. So ultimately put together a development plan and a solicitation of development partners that highlighted really key ways that the public space could be incorporated while still minimizing the impact of views to the river from the historic buildings. There were 8 different developers that responded to this project. And then ultimately now it's a mix of condos, apartments, retail, public open space, and public parking on this one site to meet a lot of different public interests. The developer on this project is a developer out of Chapel Hill, entered into a Brownfields agreement themselves. So the city didn't initiate that process. The developer did, to my best recollection. But Brownfields tax credits were ultimately as part of the financial analysis that the private developer utilized when thinking about the feasibility for this project. This is a cool project in Hendersonville, North Carolina, that we got to work on. It was the Gray Hosiery Mill in downtown Hendersonville. Again, the same scope of pre-development feasibility analysis for this old mill that the city owned. They wanted to preserve this historic structure. They also wanted to create a housing of different mix of incomes, so not just all market rate. This project ultimately ended up being 35 residential units, with 5 of those units restricted at 80% of the area median income. Total $7 million project that was completed in 2021. This project right here utilized historic tax credits, seller financing. So the city of Hendersonville provided a loan to the developer as part of the overall public-private partnership on this deal. And that the city also, similar to Gastonia, entered into this Brownfields agreement that then passed on those tax credits and those tax benefits for the first 5 years of this building being in service to the developer on this project. It was cool that this project was awarded an NC Main Street Award as the Best Adaptive Reuse Project in 2021. I know that prior to DFI getting involved, there were a lot of different public uses that were considered as part of the redevelopment strategy for this building. And ultimately, it landed on sort of a private redevelopment opportunity because of the costs that were considered for sort of the public use of this building. The Kessler Mill in Salisbury, North Carolina. This is an ongoing project, and Hannah Jacobson, who couldn't be here, we've been working DFI with the city of Salisbury for many years on lots of different projects. We were excited to get involved in this one here at the Kessler Mill site. This is a fascinating. I think this is a story that a lot of communities have seen in terms of a mill that closed down, was demolished. The city took ownership of the mill with several different significant contamination concerns on the site. The city again took the leadership in entering into the Brownfields agreement and cleaning up the site, instead of essentially prepping it for private redevelopment. We've been working with the city on the public interest and the community outreach to identify a development strategy for this site. Right now, the program is focused around affordable housing, a mix of both rental and for sale. Also incorporating open space. There is a floodplain and a creek that run through the site also. And then also how to reconnect this old mill site into the surrounding neighborhood. This is a very preliminary site plan that was developed to understand what kind of program could be accommodated on the site. This was not by any means a final concept. We've had a lot of, I think even Hannah showed, or in that one image that Jocelyn showed, there was a more refined image, but we've yet to make any public presentations of information on these updated concept plans. But in 2024, they'll most likely be going out to solicitation, identifying and helping the city negotiate with private developers on the redevelopment of this site for housing and also potentially community center. The tools that we're evaluating at this point are low-income housing tax credits, also public participation and maybe down payment assistance to support affordable home ownership. But then also, again, the city initiated that Brownfields agreement on this site, which is, again, another tool that the private developers are going to be utilizing when thinking about their sort of capital stack and their ongoing cash flow for their private redevelopment. So again, the city taking that leadership role has unlocked a different tool that we can communicate with private developers to make a project more financially feasible. And the last project I'll highlight is one that's really exciting to us at DFI. This is a community health center. This is in Kinston, North Carolina. This is a site that we have been working on at DFI for, I don't know, at least 7 years. It was an old mill at a very high traffic intersection in East Kinston. And East Kinston has a lot of challenges. It had the hurricanes that flooded a major portion of this neighborhood. It's just got a lot of challenges to overcome. And this site was identified by the city. The city acquired this site many years back, but this is a highly visible, high trafficked intersection in East Kinston. And this has gone through many different iterations in terms of what kind of potential program can be accommodated on this site. And ultimately, we've been working with, again, the city for years on this project. And just recently, the Kinston Community Health Center with a private developer have taken on this site. The city donated this property to the health center. There is a mix of new market tax credits, the Brownfields agreement that the city entered into, and the city donating this property to this nonprofit as a way to make this project financially feasible from the private development perspective for a community health center. So a really impactful use for East Kinston, an area that has seen a lot of disinvestment and a lot of challenges in the last couple of decades. And so the last thing I want to touch on today is kind of going back to this slide of where we sort of see an idea for development and where local government plays that role. All of these projects that I just mentioned is where the city had control or a path to control for some of these properties, whether they knew that they could get an option on these properties, but then they did the feasibility. The city led the process in doing this feasibility analysis, spending that money up front, taking a little bit more time to make sure that those public interests were identified, and then ultimately identifying those partners to get to a project all the way through to entitlement and construction. Now, I won't say that these projects wouldn't have happened if there wasn't city involvement in this sort of forefront. I don't think the projects would have happened the same way that they ended up. They could have, but it just highlights here that the city's involvement, taking that leadership role, identifying those public's interests, identifying the sites, getting them under control, doing that feasibility analysis to essentially tee up the projects for ultimately selecting of private developers was a critical way to ultimately seeing them redeveloped and making sure that the developers meet the goals of the community rather than just having development come in, do what they feel most likely aligns with their public interests, or sorry, with their own interests, and not necessarily considering what the community itself wanted to see happen with the redevelopment of the sites. So with that, here's my information. I'll stop sharing. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer, or at least try my best to answer any of the questions that come up. If not, here's my email. I'm always happy to chat more about these projects or other projects that maybe you all are undertaking also.
Feel free to type your questions in the chat. I'm looking at that, and if you're not comfortable shouting out to the group, I can read them out as well. I'll just add, thank you. This is amazing. I think you made a comment about this process being iterative, and I think that's something that sometimes we miss. We often think of these processes as a very stepwise. You have to go from one thing to the next, and even a residential reuse. We understand that lots of people need affordable housing. That assessment on our end is significantly different than an assessment for a parking lot or even a baseball stadium, even, right? So I think that is critical to understand. So maybe we're going down the route of a commercial reuse or something like that, but then the community says, no, we really need affordable housing. Well, let us know, and then we can reassess, look at the data from a residential standpoint. So from an environmentalist perspective, it is iterative as well.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, the Kinston project as an example of an iterative process that we did an assessment of all different types of uses on that site, and landing on a health center is a great win for the city of Kinston. There was a grocery store studied at that intersection because the community, the neighborhood needed that. There was a slew of other interested parties, but ultimately, I think where it landed is a huge win for a neighborhood that needs community sort of focused facilities.
I think we can look into, you didn't touch on your fees, but there may be some there may be some opportunities for the grants to help contribute to some of those fees. But I would encourage you to reach out to Eric for a specific cost estimate if you have a
Yeah,
project.
and I think maybe just kind of touching on that briefly and how DFI does a lot of our work on these pre-development projects, where ultimately we're going out to try to identify the private developer and then sit at the side of the local government to support the negotiations with that private developer on the redevelopment and working on a development agreement. Our fee is typically a flat fee to the local government that essentially just covers our costs. It's a very sort of low upfront fee. We then tie a portion of the fee to the success of the project and having a private developer on board, where the private developer pays DFI a fee for the project. As I mentioned, we come in there to essentially tee up projects for private developers. They really appreciate that those public interests have been established, that there's a project that has been vetted through the community in terms of essentially community engagement. Oftentimes we kind of see it as a win-win where the private developer has a lot more of a easy way to get a project approved because it's been already vetted a lot by the planning and the community as a whole. So happy to chat more about that too, if there's any projects that people are interested in talking about. And I saw a comment about the Gastonia contact. I don't know the best contact for that one right now off the top of my head. And who wrote that? That was
Meredith.
Meredith.
Sorry, Meredith. I thought you meant Salisbury. I didn't read that closely enough. I'll talk
Yeah.
with Jordan.
Thank you.
I'll talk with Jordan. We'll get you a contact. Yep.
Yeah, and I'll get a yeah. It sounds like Jordan knows the Gastonia well too, so
Yes.
I'll get a contact for that one also and send it off to you.
So 2 more quick announcements, and then I'll stop recording, and you're welcome to go, or we can keep chatting either way. Sean, who just posted in the chat, is with our Region 4 tab provider, NJIT. And if you have a grant application you need reviewed, please email that email address. The other thing to share is, and Jesse posted the link in the chat as well. Thank you, Jesse. They are doing a decoding Brownfields workshop at their office in Kernersville. You can register at the link that he posted in the chat. I'm planning on attending that meeting as well. I'm looking forward to it. So lots of opportunities to learn about Brownfields. And so with that, I will stop the recording, and you are